They say a man can endure the wind, the snow, and the loneliness of the Wyoming plains, but he cannot endure a house without a soul. In 1889, a hardened rancher named Caleb Montgomery went to the Laramie train station to pick up a wife he'd never met. He was expecting a partner to help him survive the winter. What he found was a woman trembling on the platform, a purple bruise shattering her face, and a cruel note pinned to her coat that read, "Broken. Do not want." What Caleb did next didn't just break the rules of the West, it started a war. This is the story of the bride who was thrown away, and the man who was willing to burn the world down to keep her safe. Laramie, Wyoming Territory. The 14th of November, 1889. The wind in Laramie didn't just blow, it bit. It had teeth, chewing through wool coats and leather gloves, seeking the bone. Caleb Montgomery stood near the edge of the wooden platform, his boots coated in a fresh layer of dust and frost. At 36, Caleb was a man carved out of the landscape itself, rugged, silent, and unyielding. He adjusted the brim of his hat, his eyes narrowing as the iron beast known as the Union Pacific No. 119 screeched its way into the station, belching black smoke into the gray sky. He wasn't a man given to nervousness. He had faced cattle rustlers in the Bighorn Basin and survived the blizzard of '86 that had wiped out half the territory's livestock. But today, his hands felt clammy inside his gloves. He was here for a wife. It was a business arrangement, mostly. That's what he told himself. The Double Bar M Ranch was too much for one man and a handful of aging hands. He needed someone to manage the house, someone to keep the silence from becoming deafening. He had answered an advertisement from a seemingly respectable agency in St. Louis. Her name was Sarah. That was all he really knew, other than the neat, looping handwriting in her single letter of acceptance. The train hissed to a halt. Passengers spilled out, businessmen in bowler hats, miners headed for the hills, and families clinging to each other. Caleb watched the doors of the second passenger car. A woman stepped down. She was small, wrapped in a coat that looked 2 sizes too big and a shade too thin for a Wyoming winter. She held a battered carpet bag in one hand, her knuckles white against the handle. Caleb stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Miss Sarah?" The woman froze. She didn't turn to look at him immediately. She kept her head bowed, the rim of her bonnet pulled low, obscuring her face. "I'm Caleb Montgomery," he said, his voice a low rumble over the noise of the station. We have an arrangement." She turned then, slowly, like a frightened animal cornered in a barn. As she lifted her face, the breath hitched in Caleb's throat. It wasn't her beauty, though she had fine, pale features and hair the color of dried wheat. It was the violence written across her skin. The entire left side of her face was swollen, a mottled canvas of purple, black, and angry yellow. Her lip was split, a jagged line of dried blood marking the corner of her mouth. Her left eye was swollen almost shut. Caleb stood paralyzed for a heartbeat. This wasn't just a fall. This was a beating, but it was the piece of paper that made his blood turn to ice. Pinned to the lapel of her gray coat, right over her heart, was a folded piece of heavy cardstock. It wasn't an identification tag. It was a message. Caleb stepped closer, ignoring the way she flinched when his shadow fell over her. He reached out, his rough fingers gentle as he unpinned the note. She didn't stop him. She just stared at his chest, shaking uncontrollably. He unfolded the paper. The handwriting was jagged, angry, and masculine. It read, "Is greater than goods damaged. Won't obey. Taking the next train back east? No refunds. She's yours if you want the scrap." Caleb read it twice. The rage that ignited in his gut was unlike anything he had felt in years. It was a cold, focused fury. He looked around the platform, half expecting to see the coward who had done this, but the crowd was thinning. He looked back at her. Who did this? Sarah didn't speak. She couldn't. Her teeth were chattering, whether from the biting cold or pure terror. He couldn't tell. A tear leaked from her good eye, tracking through the dust on her cheek. Caleb crushed the note in his fist. He looked at the other men on the platform, the station master, a few drifters who were staring openly at the battered woman. He saw the judgment in their eyes, Damaged goods. He took a step closer, effectively blocking their view of her with his broad shoulders. He didn't ask her if she wanted to come. He didn't ask for an explanation. Not yet. Where is your trunk? He asked, his voice softer now. I don't have one, she whispered. Her voice was raspy, broken. He kept it. Caleb's jaw tightened until it ached. All right. He reached out and took the carpet bag from her trembling hand. She flinched violently, raising an arm as if to ward off a blow. Caleb froze. He slowly lowered his hand, showing her his empty palms. He waited until she lowered her arm, her eyes wide with panic. I ain't gonna hurt you, Sarah, he said, his voice steady as bedrock. And nobody else is gonna hurt you, either. Not while you're with me. He saw the doubt in her eyes. She didn't believe him. Why would she? But she nodded. A tiny, jerky motion. Come on, he said, gesturing toward the edge of the station where his wagon waited. Let's get you out of the cold. As they walked, Caleb shoved the crumbled note into his pocket. He didn't throw it away. He kept it. Because whoever wrote that note was out there, and Caleb Montgomery had a feeling that someday he was going to make the man eat that paper. The wagon ride to the Double Bar M took 4 hours. For the first 2, neither of them spoke a word. The landscape of the Wyoming territory was unforgiving in November. The plains rolled out in endless sheets of brown and gray, broken only by jagged rock formations and the distant, looming silhouette of the Medicine Bow Mountains. The wind howled through the canvas cover of the wagon, rattling the wooden frame. Caleb drove the team of grays with an easy familiarity, but his mind was racing. He stole glances at Sarah out of the corner of his eye. She sat on the bench seat beside him, wrapped in a buffalo robe he had insisted she take. She held it tight under her chin, staring straight ahead at the horse's ears. He noticed the details now. The way she held her left wrist gingerly against her stomach, suggesting a sprain or a fracture. The way her breathing was shallow, perhaps to avoid aggravating a bruised rib. There's a canteen under the seat, Caleb said finally, breaking the heavy silence. Water's cold, but it's wet. Sarah jumped at the sound of his voice. She hesitated, then reached down with her right hand, fumbling for the metal flask. She couldn't get the cap off. Her left hand was useless. Here, Caleb said. He looped the reins into one hand and took the canteen with the other, unscrewing it with a quick twist of his thumb and forefinger. He handed it back. Thank you, she whispered. She took a small sip, wincing as the water touched her split lip. We got about 10 miles left, Caleb said, keeping his eyes on the horizon. My ranch is called the Double Bar M. It ain't a palace, just a working cattle ranch. Got a housekeeper named Hattie. She's opinionated, but she's got a good heart. Sarah lowered the canteen. Mr. Montgomery. Caleb. Caleb, she tested the name, her voice shaking. You saw the note. I did. You don't have to. Keep me. The words rushed out of her, fueled by shame. I can work. I can scrub floors in town. You don't have to take on a burden. I know I'm not what you paid for. Caleb pulled on the reins, bringing the horses to a sudden halt. The wagon creaked and settled into the dirt. The silence of the plains rushed in, vast and overwhelming. He turned on the bench to face her fully. Look at me, Sarah. She hesitated, then turned her battered face toward him. The late afternoon sun highlighted the gruesome colors of the bruise. I didn't order a piece of furniture from a catalog, Caleb said, his voice hard but not angry. I sent for a wife, a partner. Whatever happened to you before you got off that train? That wasn't your doing. I can see that. He said I was stubborn, she murmured, looking down at her lap. He said I needed to be broken before I could be of use. Who? Caleb asked. The man in Cheyenne, she said. The agency. There was a mix-up. Or a deal. I don't know. They sent me to a man named Sterling first. 2 days ago, Caleb's blood went cold. Sterling. Beaufort Sterling. Everyone in the territory knew the name. The Sterlings were money, old money, dirty money. They owned the biggest slaughterhouses in Cheyenne and half the politicians in the state capital. Beaufort was the youngest son, known for his gambling debts and a temper that was rumored to be lethal. "Beaufort Sterling did this to you?" Caleb asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. She nodded, tears spilling over again. He didn't like that I asked questions about the letters I was supposed to write. He hit me. Then he told his men to put me on the train to Laramie. He pinned that note on me and laughed. He said you were a dirt-poor rancher who deserved his leftovers." Caleb looked out at the horizon. The rage was a physical weight in his chest now. Sterling hadn't just beaten a woman. He had treated her like cattle and sent her to Caleb as a direct insult. It was a power play, a joke between rich men at the expense of human dignity. Caleb clicked his tongue, urging the horses forward again. The wagon lurched into motion. "You ain't leftovers, Sarah," Caleb said, staring straight ahead. "And you ain't alone now." "He's powerful," she whispered. "If he changes his mind, if he wants me back, let him come," Caleb said. He reached down to his hip, resting his hand momentarily on the handle of his Colt Peacemaker. It was a subtle movement, but a definitive one. The double bar M stands on its own ground, and on my ground. We don't hit women, and we don't give them up to men like Sterling. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but the air between them had changed. It wasn't warmer. Exactly, the fear was still there, but the isolation had fractured. As the sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, the ranch came into view. A sturdy main house built of timber and stone, a large barn, and corrals filled with the shifting shapes of Hereford cattle. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth. Caleb pulled the wagon up to the front porch. The front door flew open, and a stout, older woman with gray hair pulled into a severe bun stepped out, wiping her hands on an apron. This was Hattie. Hattie looked at Caleb, then at the girl huddled in the buffalo robe. She saw the bruise immediately. Her expression went from welcoming to horrified in a split second. "Lord have mercy," Hattie breathed, rushing down the steps. "Caleb, what on God's green earth happened?" "Help her down, Hattie," Caleb said, jumping off the wagon and moving to the horses. "And get the medical kit, the one with the laudanum and the stitching needle." "Stitching needle?" Hattie gasped, reaching up to help Sarah. Sarah winced as she climbed down, her legs wobbling. Hattie caught her, wrapping a strong arm around the girl's waist. "I've got you, child," Hattie cooed, her maternal instincts kicking into overdrive. "I've got you. Come inside. We have hot stew and a fire." Caleb watched them go inside. He stood alone in the darkening yard, the wind whipping his duster coat around his legs. He unhitched the horses and led them to the barn, his movements mechanical. As he brushed down the grays, his mind was already calculating. Beaufort Sterling was a man of ego. If he found out Caleb hadn't rejected the damaged goods, if he found out Caleb was keeping her and caring for her, Sterling might take it as a challenge. Caleb checked his rifle in the scabbard on his saddle. He checked the load in his revolver. He walked back toward the house, the yellow light from the windows spilling onto the snow. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a guardian, and he had a feeling the war for Sarah's life had only just begun. The kitchen of the Double Bar M was the heart of the house, dominated by a massive cast-iron stove that radiated heat into the corners of the room. But that night, the warmth seemed to stop at the threshold of the wooden table where Sarah sat, shivering violently. Hattie moved with the efficiency of a woman who had raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands. She had a basin of hot water, a bottle of harsh-smelling carbolic acid, and a strip of clean linen. Caleb stood by the fireplace, his back to the room, staring into the flames. He had removed his heavy duster and hat, revealing a thick flannel shirt and suspenders. But he kept his gun belt on. It hung off the back of a chair, the heavy iron of the Colt within arm's reach. "This is going to sting, child," Hattie said softly, dipping a cloth into the solution. Sarah gripped the edge of the table. "I'm ready." As Hattie cleaned the split in Sarah's lip and the gash above her eyebrow, Sarah didn't cry out. She made small, stifled noises in the back of her throat, like a wounded bird. Every whimper seemed to tighten the muscles in Caleb's back. He turned around when Hattie picked up the needle. "Is that necessary?" Caleb asked, his voice rough. "The cut over the eye is deep, Caleb," Hattie said, threading the needle with steady hands. "If I don't stitch it, it'll scar ugly and maybe get infected. She's a pretty thing underneath this mess. We ought to save what we can." Sarah looked up at Caleb. Her good eye was a piercing blue, filled with a mixture of pain and profound apology. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her speech slurred by the swelling. "To bring this into your home." Caleb walked over to the table. He pulled out a chair and sat opposite her. For the first time, he took off his leather gloves, revealing hands that were calloused and scarred from barbed wire and rope. "Sarah," he said, waiting until she met his gaze. "You didn't bring this. A devil did. And devils don't get invited to dinner at my table." He reached out and placed his large, rough hand over her small, trembling one on the tabletop. He didn't squeeze. He just let the weight of his hand anchor her. "Squeeze my hand when it hurts," he instructed. Hattie began to stitch. Sarah's grip on Caleb's hand was bone-crushing. She squeezed until his knuckles popped, her eyes squeezing shut, tears leaking out and mixing with the blood Hattie was wiping away. Caleb didn't flinch. He took her pain, silent and steady, a grounding rod for her agony. When it was over, Hattie bandaged the eye and applied a salve of arnica and beeswax to the purple bruising on her cheek. "You're done," Hattie declared, wiping her brow. "Now, you need sleep. A week of it. By the looks, I can sleep in the barn," Sarah said quickly, trying to stand up. She swayed dangerously. "Or on the floor by the fire. I don't want to be a trouble." Caleb stood up and gently pushed her back down by the shoulder. "You aren't a dog, Sarah. You don't sleep on the floor. But the rooms. There's 2 bedrooms upstairs," Caleb lied. There were 2 rooms, but one was filled with storage and dusty tack. The other was his. "You take the one on the left. It's got the best view of the valley. Hattie sleeps in the room off the kitchen. I'll be elsewhere. The bunkhouse." Hattie supplied quickly, catching Caleb's eye. "Caleb sleeps in the bunkhouse during calving season anyway. He prefers it. It wasn't calving season, and the bunkhouse was drafty and smelled of unwashed cowboys." But Caleb nodded. "That's right." Hattie helped Sarah up the stairs. Caleb remained in the kitchen, listening to their footsteps on the floorboards above. He heard the door close. He walked to the window and looked out into the pitch-black night. The wind was howling again, somewhere out there in the dark, 30 miles away in Cheyenne. Beaufort Sterling was likely drinking brandy in a warm parlor, laughing about the broken toy he'd discarded. Caleb touched the pocket where he'd kept the note. He felt a dark, heavy certainty settling in his gut. This wasn't over. Men like Sterling didn't just throw things away. They resented anyone else picking them up. The next few days were a blur of snow and silence. Sarah stayed in the room upstairs. Hattie brought her trays of broth, biscuits, and tea. Caleb worked the ranch, driving himself harder than usual. He fixed fences that didn't desperately need fixing. He chopped enough wood to last 2 winters. He was working off a surplus of aggression that had nowhere to go. On the 4th day, Caleb came in for lunch to find Sarah in the kitchen. She was dressed in a simple calico dress Hattie had dug out of an old trunk likely belonging to Hattie's long-deceased sister. It was a little loose, but clean. Sarah's face was still a map of violence. The bruising had turned a garish green and yellow, and the stitches were stark black against her pale skin. But she was standing. She was at the sink, trying to peel potatoes with one hand, her injured wrist bound in a sling Hattie had fashioned. "What are you doing?" Caleb asked, stamping the snow off his boots. Sarah jumped, dropping the potato. It rolled across the floor to Caleb's feet. She looked terrified, her eyes darting to the door as if she expected him to throw her out. I have to earn my keep," she stammered. "I can't just lie there. I know I'm not. I'm not a wife to you yet. But I can cook. I can clean." Caleb picked up the potato. He walked over to the sink and placed it on the counter. "Hattie," Caleb called out. Hattie appeared from the pantry, wiping flour from her hands. "Yes, boss?" Did you tell Sarah she had to peel potatoes to eat? Lord, no, Hattie huffed. I told her to sit her backside down in the rocking chair, but she's stubborn as a mule. Keeps saying she's useless. Caleb looked down at Sarah. She was trembling again. He realized then just how deep the damage went. It wasn't just her face. Her spirit had been kicked until it believed it had no value unless it was serving someone. Sarah, Caleb said, his voice low. Leave the potatoes, please, she begged, tears welling up. If I don't work, why would you keep me? Burn the note. Caleb interrupted, his voice sharp. Sarah flinched, and he immediately softened his tone, taking a half step back. Sarah, look at me. She looked up. You are my wife, he said. Technically, they weren't married, yet the circuit judge wasn't due for another month, but he said it with the weight of a vow. That means this is your house. You don't work for your keep in your own house. You heal. That is your only job. To heal. But why? She asked, her voice cracking. Why would you care? Look at me. I am looking at you, Caleb said. He reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently brushing a stray lock of hair away from her uninjured cheek. His thumb grazed her skin, rough against smooth. And I see a woman who survived. That's worth more to me than a peeled potato. Sarah stared at him, her breath hitching. For the first time since she arrived, the tension in her shoulders dropped an inch. Sit down, Caleb ordered gently. I'll peel the damn potatoes. And he did. The cowboys of the Double Bar M would have laughed themselves silly to see Caleb Montgomery, the hardest man in the territory, standing at a kitchen sink peeling spuds while a battered woman watched him from a rocking chair with wide, wondering eyes. But Caleb didn't care. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. 2 weeks passed. The snow deepened, isolating the ranch from the rest of the world. It was a cocoon of safety. Sarah's face began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The swelling went down, revealing high cheekbones and a delicate jawline. The stitches came out, leaving a small, jagged pink line through her eyebrow that gave her a look of fierce character rather than just victimhood. She began to smile. It was small and tentative, usually directed at Hattie, but occasionally, Caleb would catch a glimpse of it across the dinner table. It felt like the sun breaking through a storm, but the world outside was waiting. Supplies were running low: coffee, flour, and ammunition. Caleb couldn't put it off any longer. He had to go to Laramie. I'm going to town tomorrow, Caleb announced at dinner. He was cutting a steak, but his eyes were on Sarah. She froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. The fear returned instantly. Town? Need supplies, Caleb said. I'll be back by sundown. Can I come? She asked. No, Caleb said, too quickly. He saw her face fall and sighed. It's too cold, Sarah. And I don't want you bumping into anyone until you're fully mended. He didn't say, I don't want Sterling's men to see you yet. But the implication hung in the air. Okay, she whispered. The next morning, Caleb saddled his black gelding, Midnight, and hitched the wagon. He checked his Colt, loading 6 rounds instead of the usual 5 he carried for safety. He slid a Winchester rifle into the boot of the wagon. Lock the doors, he told Hattie. If anyone rides up who isn't me or the boys, you put a scattergun through the window and ask questions later. I know the drill, Caleb, Hattie said, her eyes serious. Caleb looked at Sarah, who was standing on the porch, wrapped in the buffalo robe. She looked small against the vast white backdrop of the snowy plains. I'll bring you something, he said awkwardly. He wasn't good at this. Just come back, she said. Laramie, Wyoming. The town was bustling despite the cold. Caleb tied the wagon in front of Miller's General Store and went about his business with efficient speed. He bought 50 pounds of flour, a sack of coffee beans, dried beans, and a bolt of blue calico cloth that caught his eye. It matched Sarah's eyes. He was loading the last of the supplies when a voice called out from the boardwalk. Montgomery, you old son of a badger. It was Sheriff Tom O'Malley, a man Caleb respected, mostly. Tom was honest, but he was tired. Tom, Caleb nodded, tossing a sack of grain into the wagon. Tom walked over, his thumbs hooked in his belt. He looked around conspiratorially, then lowered his voice. "Word is you picked up a package at the station a couple weeks back. A package Beaufort Sterling put on the train." Caleb went still. He turned slowly to face the sheriff. "I picked up my wife, Tom. Is that a crime?" "No," Tom said, chewing on a toothpick. "But Sterling has been making noise in Cheyenne. He's got some hired guns asking around the stations. Seems he thinks your wife accidentally took something that belongs to him." "She didn't take a thing but the clothes on her back," Caleb said, his voice dipping into a growl. "And barely that. He says she stole a ledger," Tom said. "A small black book. Says it's got his family's cattle records in it. He wants it back. And he wants the girl back too. Answer for the theft." Caleb's mind raced. "A ledger. She doesn't have it," Caleb said firmly. "Just telling you, Caleb," Tom said, stepping back. "Sterling is a viper. If he thinks she has it, he won't stop at sending a note. He'll send fire. Watch your back." Caleb finished loading the wagon, his heart hammering a cold rhythm against his ribs. He didn't go to the saloon. He didn't stop for a drink. He turned the wagon around and headed straight back to the Double Bar M. The sun was setting when he pulled into the yard. The house was dark, which was wrong. Hattie always lit the lamps at dusk. Caleb didn't bother hitching the horses. He jumped down, the Winchester in his hand, and ran to the porch. He kicked the door open. "Hattie, Sarah, we're here." Hattie's voice came from the kitchen. Caleb rushed in. Hattie was on the floor, holding a wet rag to her head. A chaotic mess of overturned chairs and spilled flour covered the floor. "What happened?" Caleb roared, scanning the room. "Two men," Hattie gasped. "They came an hour ago. Said they were looking for the girl. I tried to stop them. One of them hit me with the butt of his gun." "Where is she?" Caleb demanded, panic seizing his throat. "Did they take her?" "No," a small voice said from the pantry. The pantry door creaked open. Sarah stepped out. She was holding a heavy cast-iron skillet in both hands, her knuckles white. She was shaking, but her eyes were dry and hard. "I hid," she said, "under the floorboards in the pantry. You showed me the trap door for the root cellar." Caleb exhaled, the relief almost making his knees buckle. He went to Hattie first, checking her head. It was a bad bump, but she was conscious. "They tore the house apart," Hattie said. "They were looking for something." "The ledger," Caleb said, looking at Sarah. Sarah's eyes widened. She dropped the skillet with a loud clang. The book?" she whispered. "You have it?" Caleb asked. I didn't know," Sarah stammered. She ran to the carpet bag that was still sitting in the corner of the kitchen, the one she had arrived with. It had been dumped out by the intruders, clothes scattered everywhere. Sarah fell to her knees and ripped at the lining of the bag. "My sister gave me this bag. It has a false bottom for hiding money. When I was in Sterling's office, before he hit me, I saw a book on his desk. I thought it was his money log. I just wanted to hurt him. I wanted to take something because he wasn't going to pay me. I shoved it in the lining, and then he came in and started hitting me. I forgot I even had it." She pulled out a thin, black leather-bound notebook. Caleb took it from her. He opened it near the lantern light. It wasn't cattle records. It was a list of payoffs, names, dates, and amounts. Judge Miller, Senator Thorne, Marshall Davis. And beside the names, notes about land deeds, land that had been seized illegally from homesteaders and sold to the railroad companies through shell corporations owned by the Sterling family. This wasn't just a theft. This was a death sentence. This book could hang the entire Sterling family and half the government of Wyoming. "My God," Caleb whispered. "They didn't find it," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "They tore the bag apart, but they didn't check the lining." "They'll be back," Caleb said, snapping the book shut. "And they won't just be looking next time. They'll bring an army." He looked at Sarah. She was terrified, expecting him to hand the book over, maybe hand her over to save his ranch. Caleb walked over to the fireplace. For a second, he thought about throwing the book in the fire. It would end the threat. If the proof was gone, Sterling might leave them alone. But then he looked at Sarah's face, the fading bruise, the scar on her eyebrow. He thought about the note. Goods damaged. Sterling had destroyed lives to fill this book. He had hurt Sarah. Caleb shoved the book into his inside jacket pocket. "Pack your things," Caleb said to Hattie and Sarah. "Warm clothes. Only what you can carry." "Are we running?" Sarah asked, her voice small. Caleb looked at her, and a dark, dangerous smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a wolf that had just decided to stop running and start hunting. "No," Caleb said. "I'm taking you to the Highline cabin in the mountains. You'll be safe there with Hattie." "And you?" Sarah asked, stepping toward him. "Where will you be?" Caleb checked the load in his Winchester. "I'm going to send a telegram to the U.S. Marshal in Denver," Caleb said. "And then, I'm going to get the boys. If Sterling wants a war, I'm going to give him one he'll never forget." The ride to the Highline cabin was a silent, brutal ascent into the teeth of the Medicine Bow Mountains. The air grew thinner, sharper, stinging the lungs with every breath. Caleb rode point, his eyes scanning the ridgeline for any sign of pursuit, while Hattie drove the small buckboard wagon with Sarah huddled beside her. The cabin was little more than a hunter's shack, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney, and a door that had to be shouldered open against the drift of snow. Inside, it smelled of pine resin and old wood smoke. Caleb wasted no time. He lit a fire in the hearth, while Hattie began unpacking the meager supplies they had brought. Sarah stood by the door, watching him. She looked different now. The terror that had defined her existence since the train station had hardened into something brittle but fierce. "You're not staying," she said. It wasn't a question. Caleb straightened up, brushing ash from his hands. "No. If they come to the ranch and find it empty, they'll burn it to the ground. And then they'll track us here. I have to lead them away. They'll kill you," Sarah whispered, stepping closer. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows across the scars on her face. "There are too many of them. Caleb, you saw what they did to the house. That was just a warning. I've got 3 good men down there," Caleb said, checking the cinch on his saddlebags. "Rusty, Jim, and Shorty. They've ridden with me since the cattle drives of '82. We know the land. Sterling's hired guns don't." He walked over to her. The distance between them felt charged, electric. He wanted to pull her into his arms, to promise her that they would grow old on that porch. Watching the seasons change, but promises were dangerous things when bullets were about to fly. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "You keep that door barred. Hattie has the scattergun. Don't open it for anyone but me. If I'm not back in 2 days." He didn't finish the sentence. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy envelope. "This is the deed to the land," he said, pressing it into her hand. "And enough cash to get you to California. If I don't come back, you sell the herd. You take Hattie, and you go. Don't look back." Sarah took the envelope, her hands shaking, but her eyes were dry. She grabbed the lapels of his coat, pulling him down until their foreheads touched. "You come back," she hissed fiercely. "You didn't save me just to leave me alone in the snow, Caleb Montgomery. You don't get to be a hero and die. You come back." Caleb closed his eyes for a second, breathing in the scent of her soap and cold air. He kissed her forehead, a lingering, desperate press of lips against skin. "I'll come back," he lied. He didn't know if he could keep that promise. He turned and walked out into the snow without looking back. As he mounted Midnight and turned the horse down the mountain trail, he felt a part of him tearing away. The Double Bar M Ranch, late afternoon. When Caleb rode into the yard, the sky was the color of a bruised plum. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence over the ranch. Rusty, the foreman, was waiting on the porch. He was a man of 50, with skin like leather and a mustache that drooped past his chin. Beside him sat Jim, a young breaker with a quick draw, and Shorty, a massive, silent man who was better with an axe than a gun, but dangerous with both. "Saw the wagon tracks heading up the mountain," Rusty said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Ladies safe? For now," Caleb said, dismounting. "You boys didn't have to stay." "Hell, boss," Jim grinned, spinning the cylinder of his revolver. "I got nowhere to go. Besides, I owe the Sterlings. They cheated my pa out of his claim in '85. "They're coming," Caleb said, pulling his Winchester from the scabbard. "I reckon by nightfall. Sterling won't come himself. He'll send Dutch Weaver." The name made the men stiffen. Dutch Weaver was a regulator, a hired killer who had cleared out the miners during the strikes in Colorado. "He didn't take prisoners. Weaver likes fire," Rusty noted grimly. "Then we wet the roofs," Caleb ordered. "We board the windows. We turn this house into a fortress. If they want the ledger, they're going to have to walk through hell to get it." They worked through the twilight. They hauled buckets of water from the trough to soak the shingles of the main house and the barn. They overturned heavy oak tables to block the windows, leaving only narrow firing slits. They positioned ammunition boxes in the corners of the main room. As the last light faded from the sky, the ranch was ready. It stood dark and silent against the snow. Caleb sat in the rocking chair by the front window, his rifle across his knees. He touched the breast pocket of his shirt where he had moved the ledger. It felt heavy, like a stone. "Boss," Shorty whispered from the kitchen doorway. "Riders." Caleb peered through the slit in the boards. On the ridge overlooking the valley, a line of torches appeared. 10, 12, maybe 15 riders. They moved slowly, like a funeral procession, the flames reflecting off the snow. They stopped at the edge of the yard, just out of effective rifle range. A single rider separated from the group and trotted forward. Even in the dim light, Caleb recognized the duster and the wide-brimmed black hat. Dutch Weaver. "Montgomery." Weaver's voice carried easily across the frozen air. It was a smooth, cultured voice, which made it all the more terrifying. "We don't need to make this messy. Mr. Sterling is a reasonable man." Caleb stood up and walked out onto the porch. He stood in the open, a clear target, his rifle held loosely in one hand. "Sterling doesn't know the meaning of reason," Caleb called back. "And you're trespassing, Weaver." Weaver chuckled. "I'm here for the property, Caleb. The book. And the girl. Hand them over, and we ride away. You keep your ranch. You keep your life." "The girl is my wife," Caleb said, his voice echoing off the barn. "And the book is my insurance." "Your wife is a thief," Weaver replied, his tone hardening. "And that book is a death warrant. Last chance, cowboy. Give us the girl." Caleb raised the Winchester. The metallic clack-clack of the lever action was loud in the silence. "Come and take her," Caleb said. Weaver sighed, almost theatrically. He raised a hand. "Burn it all," Weaver commanded. From the darkness, the muzzle flashes lit up the night like fireflies. The truce ended with a single command from Dutch Weaver. "Burn it all." The night exploded. Muzzle flashes lit up the ridge like fireflies, and bullets chewed through the timber walls of the ranch house. Caleb, Rusty, and Jim returned fire from the boarded-up windows, the heavy boom of Rusty's buffalo gun answering the rapid crack of the attackers' repeaters. "They're flanking us," Jim yelled, reloading his Colt with shaking hands. "They're trying to get behind the barn. Hold your fire until you see targets," Caleb roared, levering his Winchester. He spotted a shadow near the corral and fired. The shadow dropped, but there were too many of them. A flaming torch arched through the sky, landing on the dry hay of the barn roof. Within minutes, the structure was a towering inferno, casting a hellish orange glow over the yard. The heat radiated through the walls of the house, and the smoke began to choke them. "We can't hold them, boss." Rusty coughed, wiping soot from his face. "They're using the fire for cover. They'll rush the porch any second." Caleb looked at his men. They were exhausted, bleeding, and outnumbered. He had led them into a death trap. He made a decision. "Get to the cellar," Caleb ordered, pointing to the pantry. "Take the tunnel to the creek bed. Go." "And leave you?" Jim spat. "Not a chance. That's an order." Caleb grabbed Jim by the collar, shoving him toward the trapdoor. "They want me, and they want the book. If I stay, they focus on the house. You boys get clear and flank them if you can. Move. Reluctantly, the men retreated into the dark earth. Caleb was alone. He overturned the heavy oak dining table, using it as a barricade facing the front door. He checked his ammo. 3 rounds in the rifle, 5 in the pistol. Boots stomped onto the porch. The heavy timber door groaned under a battering ram, then splintered open. Dutch Weaver stepped into the frame, silhouetted by the burning barn behind him. He looked like a demon, his long duster coat flapping in the heat. "You're all alone, Montgomery," Weaver sneered, stepping over the debris. "Come out. Give me the ledger, and I'll make it quick." Caleb stood up slowly from behind the table. He wasn't going to die hiding. "Come and get it." Weaver raised his pistol. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out not from the house, but from the ridge. One of Weaver's men on the porch crumpled. Then came the sound of thundering hooves and rattling wood. A buckboard wagon came careening down the slope, bouncing dangerously over the rocks. Hattie was driving, whipping the horses into a frenzy, and standing in the back, illuminated by the wall of fire, was Sarah. She wasn't hiding. She looked like an avenging angel, her hair whipping in the wind. "Weaver!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the roar of the fire. The wagon skidded to a halt near the burning barn. Sarah held the black ledger high in the air, dangling it perilously close to the flames. "Stop!" she yelled. "Or I throw it in." Weaver froze. The book was his payday. If it burned, Sterling would have his head. "You stupid girl," Weaver hissed, turning his gun toward her. "You think that saves you? Drop it, or you die." "If I burn this book," Sarah yelled back, her hand trembling as the heat licked at her fingers, "Sterling goes to prison anyway." "I read it, Weaver. I know the names. I know about the map inside the cover." It was a lie, there was no map, but Weaver hesitated. His eyes flicked between the girl and the fire. That split second was all Caleb needed. He didn't aim for Weaver. He aimed for the kerosene lamp hanging from the porch ceiling, directly above the gunman's head. Bang! The lamp shattered, showering Weaver in burning oil and glass. He screamed, batting at the flames on his coat, his shot going wild into the snow. "Now!" Caleb roared. He dropped his rifle and sprinted across the yard, tackling Weaver just as the man tried to level his gun at Sarah. They hit the frozen ground hard. Weaver was strong and desperate, smashing the barrel of his pistol into Caleb's temple, but Caleb didn't feel the pain. He was fighting for her. He drove a knee into Weaver's gut, ripped the gun from his hand, and delivered a single, brutal punch that knocked the fight out of the mercenary. Weaver went limp in the snow. The rest of the hired guns, seeing their leader down and taking fire from Caleb's returning men at the creek, scrambled for their horses and fled into the night. Silence rushed back into the valley, broken only by the crackling of the dying barn. Caleb stumbled toward the wagon. Sarah had dropped the book in the snow and jumped down, her legs giving out. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground. He held her so tight he thought he might crush her, burying his face in her hair. They sank into the snow together, the heat of the fire warming their backs. "You came back," Caleb whispered, his voice breaking. "You crazy, stubborn woman. I told you to run. You said we weren't alone," she sobbed, clutching his coat. "I wasn't going to let you die alone." Caleb pulled back to look at her. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes bright with tears. But the fear, the deep, paralyzed fear he had seen at the train station was gone. In its place was a fierce, unbreakable strength. He looked down at the snow where the black ledger lay, wet and trampled. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, trembling. Caleb picked up the book. "The fighting is over, but the reckoning for Sterling? That's just beginning." Denver, Colorado. January 1890. The office of U.S. Marshal Silas Grant smelled of stale tobacco and justice. It was a sterile, cold room, far removed from the blood-soaked snow of the double bar M. Caleb stood before the heavy oak desk, his hat in his hands. He looked out of place among the filing cabinets and law books, a wild thing trapped in a cage of bureaucracy. But his eyes were calm. He placed the water-stained, battered black ledger on the desk. "This is it?" Marshal Grant asked, eyeing the book like it was a stick of dynamite. "That's it," Caleb said. "Every bribe, every land grab, every name Beaufort Sterling bought to build his empire. It's all there." Grant opened the book. He flipped through the pages, his eyebrows climbing higher with every entry. He stopped at a page dated 3 years prior. "Senator Thorne," Grant muttered. "Judge Miller. Good Lord, son. You haven't just brought me a criminal. You've brought me half the territorial government. Can you take him down?" Caleb asked. Grant looked up, a grim smile touching his lips. "With this, I can hang him. Sterling thinks he owns the law. He's about to find out the law has a long memory." The trial of Beaufort Sterling was the sensation of the decade. The Sterling Ledger, as the papers called it, exposed a rot so deep in Wyoming that it took 2 years to clean out. Beaufort didn't go down fighting. He went down screaming, stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and finally, his freedom. He died 3 years later in a federal penitentiary, a broken man who had once treated people like cattle. The double bar M. Spring, 1891. The snow had finally retreated, leaving the valley a lush, vibrant green. The air was sweet, with the scent of sagebrush and wildflowers. The new barn was almost finished. It was bigger than the old one, built with timber hauled down by Caleb, Rusty, and a dozen neighbors who had heard the story of the siege and come to lend a hand. Caleb sat on the porch step, watching the sunset. He heard the screen door creak open behind him. Sarah sat down beside him. The scars on her face had faded to thin, white lines, barely visible unless you were close enough to kiss her. And Caleb was often that close. She held a piece of paper in her hand. It was old, wrinkled, and stained. The note: "Is greater than goods damaged. Won't obey. Taking the next train back east? No refunds. She's yours if you want the scrap." She smoothed it out on her knee. "I found this in your coat pocket," she said softly. "Why did you keep it?" Caleb looked at the hateful words. He remembered the rage he had felt on the platform, the way the world had looked at her like she was nothing. He took the paper from her hand. He pulled a match from his vest pocket, struck it against the sole of his boot, and held the flame to the corner of the note. They watched in silence as the paper curled and blackened, the cruel words turning to ash. The wind caught the gray flakes and carried them away, scattering them over the green grass. "I kept it to remind me," Caleb said, taking her hand. "To remind me that some men see only the cracks, while others see the light shining through them." Sarah squeezed his hand, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I'm not broken anymore, Caleb," she whispered. Caleb kissed the top of her head. "No, Sarah, you never were. You were just waiting for a house that was strong enough to hold you." They sat there until the sun dipped below the mountains, two survivors who had found peace in the middle of a war, watching the stars come out over the Wyoming plains. They weren't alone, and they never would be again. And so, the note that was meant to destroy Sarah became the fuel that burned down an empire. Caleb Montgomery didn't just save a mail-order bride, he saved himself. In a world that told them they were damaged, one by violence, the other by solitude, they found a way to be whole together. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many people do we walk past every day who are carrying invisible notes that say, "Broken"? And what would happen if, instead of looking away, we looked them in the eye and said, "You're not alone now"? If this story moved you, if you believe that love is stronger than the scars we carry, please hit that like button. It helps us share these stories with more people. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a tale from the frontier. Until next time, keep your fires burning.